We learned this week that there were 90 protests at the state capitol last year. Voters upset about everything from George Floyd's murder to tolls to vaccinations and more. And not one of those rallies turned violent. Why is that? Joining me now is University of New Haven Criminal Justice Associate Professor Mike Lawlor. You may also recognize him from his more than 2 decades as a state representative from East Haven. Mr. Lawlor, welcome to Face the Facts.
Thanks, Mike.
When you saw the siege at the U.S. Capitol and then all the video that came out of it, what were your first impressions?
Well, I think like everybody else in the country, I couldn't believe what I was watching. I was watching it live on television, sitting here in my office, and it was pretty disturbing. And you kind of saw it begin to escalate, and of course, your mind immediately goes like, where and how is this actually going to end? How bad is this really going to get? It got pretty bad, but fortunately, the worst case scenario didn't play out.
Exactly, yeah, especially we learned some of the other narratives that came out of it. This was a complex story, to say the least. We learned how officers protected our specific Connecticut delegation when those doors were smashed in. Other officers got overtaken by the crowd. We saw video of that. Even others seemingly standing aside and taking selfies. What do you make of the complex situation?
Well, I kind of look at it from a law enforcement point of view at this stage, and that I think people really don't realize how easy it is for law enforcement today to piece together the sequence of events because everyone is carrying around a smartphone. There's surveillance cameras everywhere, and the FBI, and you're seeing this begin to play out already. I mean, they'll go to search warrant for all the cell phone providers. They'll find out everybody who was in the Capitol during that time frame. They'll separate out the people who had a right to be there, the members of Congress, the staff, and then they'll get the names of all the people that were inside that building in that time. And then they'll get individual search warrants for those people. They'll read their text messages. They'll look for their photos. They can search social media. And so pretty quickly, you can find out pretty much everything you'd want to know if you're trying to convict somebody for insurrection against the United States, which is the actual crime that people ultimately will be charged with here.
And as we watch in the days since that riot, more and more people are getting arrested. So what kind of punishment can some of these people expect? Is it more serious because it was on federal property?
Well, it's a federal crime because it was located there. I think many of these people, worst case analysis, it'll be a misdemeanor for essentially trespassing. But for the individuals that they can show were either urging on members of that mob to do violence, to do damage doors, and in some cases to hang the president of the United States, or the vice president rather. I mean, these are the individuals who are going to be especially targeted for very severe punishment. Once people get arrested on the minor charges, then of course the prosecutors will have conversation with their lawyers about whether or not they're willing to testify about who said what. And I think you see this already playing out. And at the end of the day, the goal is to identify the ringleaders and hold them accountable. But those people, there was a murder. I mean, a police officer was brutally beaten to death by not one person, but a bunch of people. And everybody involved in that can either be charged directly with murder or with felony murder. It means you were engaged in a felony and someone ended up being killed. So these are going to be very serious charges for probably several hundred people, if not more.
In this day and age, there are so many digital records of everything, but does that make it easier to prove it in court because of social media, because of the videos we've seen, the text messages and tweets in advance of what happened? How does that translate when you go to court?
Well, I mean, it's pretty convincing, right? I mean, if all you have to prove is the person was inside the building at that time and wasn't allowed to be in there, that's a trespass, right? If you had to prove that they were text messaging with someone else that was one of the principals in terms of organizing this, then that's pretty clear they're part of a conspiracy. So the electronic evidence is going to be the most significant. And plus, I think they will have some firsthand testimony from people who are going to get arrested, who were not the ringleaders, and who ultimately will testify against the people who apparently planned this ahead of time and were intent on actually killing people.
What kind of coordination does it take to try to secure something like a Capitol building? I mean, we've seen the influx of troops down in D.C. We have some concerns here in Connecticut. You were in our Capitol for 24 years. Did you ever experience a violent protest there?
Nothing that was violent. There were certainly events that made people nervous. I remember back in 1991 when the income tax was first enacted here in our state, there was a crowd of 40,000 or so people who came to the Capitol to protest it. I remember former Governor Weicker made a big show of, driving to work that day and walking through the crowd to get to his office over the objection of his state police security detail. But I think, there have been some incidents, especially involving guns, right? Meaning protests involving guns. There was an incident where a protester had a little guillotine. He cut off his finger on the steps of the Capitol. That seemed pretty unusual and self-defeating in a way because he cut his trigger finger off. But nonetheless, we've had some incidents, but nothing like, there's never been any damage to the property. There's never been an assault on a police officer or a member of the legislature. There's been plenty of threats, right? And it was in the aftermath of the Sandy Hook murders back in 2012. They led to some pretty comprehensive legislation that was enacted by the legislature in the ensuing months. And some of the protests related to that were drawing people that seemed to be carrying weapons with them. At least the Capitol Police suspected that. And that's when the metal detectors were first installed at our state capitol. I mean, it was very unfortunate. I mean, a lot of state capitals did it immediately after the terrorist attacks on 9/11. Connecticut, we were reluctant to make it more difficult to access the building, but that's the way it is now. And, one of the sad parts about what happened in Washington is I think access to the Capitol itself, to public hearings, to legislators individually is going to be much more complicated now than it was in the past. This is a classic case of a few people spoiling it for everybody else. And unfortunately, we're all going to have to deal with the consequences for years to come.
Including those metal detectors in D.C. as well. Mike Lawlor from University of New Haven, we appreciate your time on Face the Facts. Hope you stay healthy and safe.
Thanks for asking me.